Hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'll be doing the Read Smart tag. It's a tag that was created by Emmelie from Prose and Petticoats and Ruben from To Read As It May Concern. And Ruben very kindly tagged me to give this a go. And it's a tag all about, I suppose, reading discipline and the kind of questions I love thinking about and I love hearing people talk about as well. So it's been a lot of fun seeing it bounce around BookTube, and I'm glad to have been given a chance to think about these a bit more. And we'll see how this goes. Hopefully, this video won't just be a reflection of my internal monologue. Hopefully, it'll have at least some structure to it and won't be too digressive. The first question is what is your strategy to stay focused and engaged while reading? I don't really have much of a strategy, really. There are a couple of things that do come to mind, and I'll do my best to explain them. They both seem a bit obvious, really, but one is just that I enjoy reading and I have I suppose a passion for it that seems to keep growing the more that I do it, and I have a curiosity that um, isn't really satisfied. The more that I read, the more curious I become, and so there's a drive there, a desire there, and I suppose I would say that if you just don't want to be reading, then don't do it. There are plenty of other valid things to do with your time. And when it comes to time, I think that's the other thing, um, which is it's kind of deeply connected to a very slow realization that I've made about the way I spend my time, um, and sort of realizing that there are certain things that I do, like watching TV, spending time on social media, that really is sort of autopilot. It's not that I want to do these things. I've just through habit have gravitated towards them, and I'm just sort of mindlessly um, engaging in them. And it's not necessarily that I'm resting, because they still kind of wear me out in their own way. And so I realised that, well, for one, reading is something I, enjoy much more. I've gone through that passion and that desire I have for it. But also, even though I'm more engaged when I'm reading than I might be when I'm just sort of scrolling through something, um, it doesn't tire me out in the same way as well. Sometimes I will be tired, and then I sit down to read, and I might not be as engaged. But I don't know that even then, sometimes reading just wakes me up because it's um, um, I don't know, it excites me. So I don't have a terribly good answer about specific strategies, other than the realization that it is one of the main things that I want to spend my time with. Yeah, it's high on the list, at least. Number two is, how does your environment influence your focus, and what can you do to optimize it? Um, Certainly, I like things to be as quiet and peaceful as possible. And so you know, I've sort of developed the habit of reading in the evening when I'm at home, because it tends to be a bit quieter, less going on, out on the street and things. One of my main reading spots is downstairs in an armchair, but that's right by a window, and so there's noise from the street, and if visitors are there, then not really going to be spending much time reading there, because it's in the living room, and so it seems a bit, I don't know, a bit selfish. And so I've got this space here as well that is more of a dedicated reading space and a quieter space. When I'm out and about, I can't really control my environment that much. Um, Something Emmelie brought up in her version was background noise, other people's conversations, and things like that. And she blocks that out with earbuds or sort of noise cancelling headphones or something like that. And normally for me, just having one earphone in with some instrumental music or something that normally does enough for me to sort of filter out any background noise. And so certainly, yeah, noise and things like that um, do have an influence. But I try to be proactive in um, finding ways to get around that, I suppose. Number three is what methods do you use to retain and recall information from what you read? There's something, at least recalling information, if I was going to be tested on everything that I read, it's not something I'm terribly good at, particularly if I'm new to a subject. Um, my understanding, my sort of view of the book will be a bit more impressionistic, I suppose. Um, However, yeah, we'll get into a bit more of this with later questions. But one of the big things for me is if I am reading a book about a subject I'm not that familiar with, um, if it's a denser book, if it's, I think particularly when I'm reading non-fiction, my reading speed slows down. And the important thing for me is, eventually I'm going to notice that I'm not reading as quickly as if I was reading fiction or something I was a bit more familiar with, or something that was a bit lighter. And the important thing for me is when I notice that, not to panic, not to speed up my reading, because it's actually, at least for me, a good thing that my reading speed has slowed down, and um, it gives me the chance to actually understand what I'm reading. And so, even though I'm not going to be able to remember every little factoid, I'm not going to remember every person's name. Um, I'm still I'm getting the main points that the author's driving at, and I'm at least understanding what I'm reading. Whereas if I try to rush and sort of power through, eventually I'm going to get to a point where I can't remember the last 5 or 10 pages that I read at all, and that I feel suddenly sort of marooned in the middle of this book that I'm terribly unfamiliar with. And so, yeah, the main thing for me is to slow down and to be happy that I've slowed down. Number four, again, my answer will be quite similar. How do you approach difficult or challenging material? And again, reading slower is certainly something that that helps, and it sort of depends on the material. Let's say if it's sort of difficult poetry, um, or something like Ulysses or something like that, there are good reading guides that you can go to. I do have a reading guide for the poetry of T.S. Eliot, but generally I tend to rely on my own impressions as a reader, and the way they change, the way I notice new things with each reread. So that can work quite well with poetry, since The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot is much shorter than Ulysses, or or In Search of Lost Time. Um, and so I don't rely too much on secondary guides, although they can be helpful. Um, what what I do is I slow down, like I said, and I take things in smaller snippets. And so, with the example of Proust, it's probably the longest novel that I'll ever read. In Search of Lost Time, it's more than 3,000 pages long, potentially approaching 4,000 pages, depending on the edition. Um, and it's a really weird book. He has his own very particular style. Um, I think I've described it before as kind of waves, where it's a kind of a digression, then it comes back a bit, then it goes on, and you just have to get used to that. Um, but it helps to take it in small chunks and to just try and process those small chunks. And then, if you're only reading small chunks, but you have more reading time, then I think it helps to have other books on the go at the same time. And for me, that certainly helps, particularly when I'm reading denser, more difficult books, to have that variety, and to sort of change gears as a reader. And I think it does help. For me, it helps with retention as well, to take it in snippets, and um, I can sort of compartmentalize the different things that I'm reading, and so I sort of jump into one box and I remember where I was up to, and the whole thing comes alive again, and then I jump into the other box and the same thing happens. And so the small snippets and the variety, the slow pace, are all things that help, at least for me, with difficult or challenging material, and also not being afraid to reread. And so with difficult poets, like T.S. Eliot or Rilke, when I reread them, almost always every time, I notice something different, and I see the poem in question from a different perspective. So not being afraid to reread is, as well, really helpful. Most of the time when I read Shakespeare, um, I tend to read the play twice, and what I found quite helpful, I tend to read the play straight through to get an idea of the plot, and get the characters straight in my head. Then I might go back and read the introduction and any sort of scholarly material that I have on the text to give a bit more context, and to immerse myself a little deeper in the world of the play. And then I'll go back, and I will read it again, and I will. That's when it feels like I'm beginning to have a conversation with the text, and I'm asking it questions, and I'm disagreeing with it, and things like that. And I think it works really well for Shakespeare plays because they're relatively short. It works really well for poems. It does work wonderfully for novels as well. It just takes a lot more time, and so when I really enjoy a novel, I will make a mental note to reread it, but it's often on a different time scale. I hope that kind of answers the question. Um, that was a bit of a digression, though. Here we go. Number 5 is, what role does note taking and annotating play in your reading process? And I feel like that's sort of something that the last two questions have been working towards. And I'm really, I'm really bad with annotations and note taking generally. I don't have a set process. At the moment, I'm reading the collected poems of Emily Dickinson, and something I like to do when I'm, particularly if it's like the collected works of a particular poet or it's a larger poetry anthology, um, I like to leave a little asterisk by the poem that I enjoyed, whether that's on the page or in the table of contents, um, just so that when I'm going back, I can see which poems jumped out to me, and then I can revisit them and sort of continue my conversation with them. And that's at least one way that I annotate my books. I've gone through through phases of actual annotation, but I'm not terribly good at that. I tend to just go with how I'm feeling, and sometimes just let the book dictate how I engage with it. I've got a couple of notebooks to show you. I won't go through the pages just in case I've written anything embarrassing. But I've got a notebook here that I sometimes use for writing. I've started using it for something else, but something that I started doing, and this was when I was reading Proust, is that as I would work out which pages, um, which sections jumped out to me, sometimes if I couldn't write down the page number or something, I just take a photograph of the page on my phone and sort of draw sort of a little circle around the section I wanted to focus on, just so I could remember it. And that was a way of not having to make sure I had a pen on me at all times, so I wasn't annotating the book per se. And then I'd go back and I would write out the section, and sometimes they were quite long. And so in this darker colour that you might be able to see here, that's a quotation. And then just in a brighter colour here, I started sort of my own commentary on it. And for me, I'm not tidy enough to do all that in the margins of a book. And I found that was a really helpful way. And, that there are only like a handful of quotations there for each sort of part, each volume of In Search of Lost Time. But I found that a really valuable way to engage with that book. And I've done similar things with some other books since then, notably with the brothers Karamazov. In this book here, this is I don't even know how to describe what kind of a notebook it is. I write down random ideas in here and notes towards sort of poems and stories that I have been working on. But I also write down quotations, whether from, whether they're, let's see if I can find something. No, I don't think I can find anything to show you, but I put in random quotations from poems, but also just random pages from, or quotations from, from the brothers Karamazov, or the random things from The Trial by Franz Kafka in here, and other bits and bobs. And they might not take up a whole page, and then maybe the rest of the page might be just some random thought that I have, or it might be the draft of a poem, or it could be anything. And so this is just a very random notebook that I have, but I try to keep it so that I'm keeping the thoughts I have about what I'm reading kind of connected to my other thoughts, and I'm not trying to separate it too much, and I'm sort of trying to bleed all these sort of disparate influences and all these different sort of channels. I'm trying to sort of bring them all together into this one place. So as you can probably gather from that, my approach to annotations and to um, note taking is rather anarchic and chaotic, but it seems to be what works for me. And the main thing for me is to have that conversation with the book. And sometimes that's on paper, sometimes it's just in my head. But either way, coming at it in a kind of conversational way, um, to ask questions back to the book tends to be enough for me to um, remember the book, for the book to stick around in my head after I've finished reading it. Number six is how do you balance reading for pleasure with reading for personal or professional development? I don't really do any reading for personal or professional development. I certainly don't read self-help books or books about business or anything like that. There may be some that in the future I probably should look into, um, but I don't know. Sometimes I feel like that kind of reading, I feel like there's someone standing over my shoulder and they're sort of saying something like, "Oh, you like reading? Here's a book, and it's actually useful. So maybe maybe spend your time reading that instead." And I recoil um, quite dramatically from that kind of attitude, and I certainly don't go into reading with the conscious aim to improve myself as a person. Um, Certainly, self improvement can be a happy side effect to reading. But I'm sure there are plenty of horrible people out there in the world who have read great books and have left them totally unchanged. Um, so yeah, don't know exactly where I'm going with that, but yeah, it's not something I'm conscious of in my reading particularly. Um, but yeah, maybe someday I'll be forced to. Number seven is what is the importance of setting reading goals? Um, for me, I do set reading goals on sort of Goodreads and things like that. Um, I tend to set it at um, a number that it's normally less than the books I'd read in the year previous. So last year I read a stupid amount of books. At least for me, I read 100 books, and I still set my goal for this year as 50 books because um, I knew that we'd be having a baby this year. I'd be having less time to read, um, but also I don't want to push myself either. And I know that 50 books for me in one year is generally pretty attainable. Um, and so it's to have it there. I don't know. In a way, it seems kind of arbitrary, but it certainly has helped me. Um, certainly during COVID, it was one of the ways that helped me focus, and it was a goal in a positive sense to have something to work towards. Um, and so it can have an importance, but I think it has become a little more arbitrary. Um, Certainly, the more important goal really is for me is just to make sure I've read something um, every day if I can, um, and it doesn't have to be a lot, but that's certainly more important than a numerical goal for the number of books I've read in any space of time. And then the very last question is what are some strategies for overcoming reading slumps or lack of motivation? Um, I don't know, there are quite a few things you could do. Um, I'm trying to think now of times I've felt that lack of motivation to read. Uh, Sometimes for me, it's just cabin fever, and I just need to get out of the house and go for a walk. Um, Normally, that does a good job. Just sort of a change of pace is really useful. Um, I think a change of pace in your reading, I think, is a really useful way to overcome potential reading slumps or whatever you'd like to call it. Um, so certainly there was a point last year in the summer where, in a short space of time, I've been reading a lot of things like Dostoevsky and Kafka and stuff, which I love, and it's stuff that sticks with me and I really enjoy. And yet I was realizing if I was going to read many more kind of heavy, um, quite depressing books like that, I knew I'd lose motivation and I wouldn't want to be reading um, as much, at least. And so I just made the choice to read a couple of books that were a bit lighter, a little sillier, and that change of pace and that um, sort of change in genre, in um, I don't know, just book length as well. Reading shorter books, um, it can be a good way. Um, Recently over this year, I've been reading a lot of big books, and certainly having one big mammoth every single month isn't always the most helpful thing to do as well. And so that's something I've recognised as well, is really variety in as many ways as your own reading taste will allow. So variety of genre and style, and of book length, and of tone, and things like that. Um, that seems to have served me pretty well. But also with the honesty of, if reading really isn't what you want to be doing right now, then it's perfectly okay not to read as well. And so, yeah, that they would be some of the things that would go through my head. Um, and I think that's everything I have to say. I hope it's made at least some kind of sense. If you have any questions, if you feel like I haven't maybe gone into as much detail in my answers to any of these questions, then feel free to let me know. But I'll leave it there, so it doesn't get too tedious. But thanks again to Emmelie and Ruben for creating it, and thanks Ruben for the tag as well. For now, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.